Welcome everybody. This is the Senior Community Center, Something to Talk About. And our programs are sponsored by Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island, which offers memory care and is soon to be offering independent living and assisted living up on Rolling Bay. Call 360-689-4314 to learn more and to ask about day stay and respite programs. I'd also like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the ancestral homelands of the Suquamish people, the people of the clear salt water, who have been stewards of the Salish Sea and surrounding lands for, well, since time immemorial. And we are grateful for their hospitality as well as that stewardship. Today, we are going to be talking about words that hurt and words that heal. And Anne Lovejoy has agreed to once again help us facilitate that conversation. But I know there are some other folks who are here as well to help with that. So thank you all.
I really hope this is a rich conversation that everybody here can share in, because I don't think any one of us has come through this far through life without having some scars from thoughtless words, some that may have been aimed at us and some that we may thoughtlessly have aimed at others. But as we've been really taking deeper looks at our culture and ourselves in the last few years, there's a lot of extremely painful things that have bubbled up, I would say, and continue to do so. I think it's one of the difficult things to do, to ask ourselves to look within. And it's pretty easy to point a finger at somebody else. We're pretty clear when other people have stepped over the line and said things that are hurtful. But sometimes it can be harder to acknowledge that we ourselves have done that. But I think we have to do both of those things to stay as clean and clear as we can these days. Even as a child, I remember hearing that sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Well, my name as a child was Annie Atwater, which really quickly became Fanny Fatwater. And I was a stocky child. And so I became Tubbo, Fatso, fat butt, lardette. I mean, I don't even tell you, like a million things that really stuck with me my whole life long. And those are really hurtful, especially if they might happen to come from your own family, for instance. And I just feel like it creates two things in us. Either it creates in us a desire never to do that to anybody else and to try really hard not to, or in some people, it turns into a kind of a retaliation thing. As I was treated, I will treat others. Some of us may have passed through that phase at some point in our life and then grown out of it as we matured and became more self-aware and decided we didn't really want to be that person. But I think today, part of the job for all of us is sort of the bystander position of sometimes being in a situation where we hear something said. Maybe it's a cultural slur, a racial slur, something that diminishes or demeans another person or a way of life. And I think it's our responsibility now to stand up and say, that's not acceptable, and here's why. And I really hope you'll all kind of jump in with some of your own examples. One of the things that has caught some of us unaware is that we may be using common words and phrases that we've heard our whole lives and had no idea that they were either racist in origin or that they include another form of bias. Like, I think it's only been in the last few years that I became aware that to talk about something being grandfathered in actually referred to a very racist practice of, especially in the southern states, not allowing people to vote unless their grandfather had voted, which obviously was deliberately created to block not just people of color, but people who were poor or uneducated as well. That kind of hidden language can trip us up sometimes. Once, I remember not that long ago, Reed and I were both kind of puzzled to hear that someone had used the word okey doke and were called out on it. And we didn't know that had a kind of a connotation of trickery, of something that was used especially to set up almost like a bait and switch situation where something was promised and then an okey doke meant it wasn't going to happen. We weren't aware of that as racial bias phrase at all. So we're still kind of learning all these things. But I'd love to hear from any of you. Actually, Kuya, you and I have talked a little bit about this, and I was going to ask you if you would mind unmuting and sharing a little of your thoughts about this.
You know, one of my thoughts have always been what's in the heart of a man will come out. And so one of the things that I always say is, you know, our tongue has the ability to bring life and death, you know, as we speak, you know, how critical we are, how we condemn others, how we judge others. And sometimes it comes out in such an unhealthy way to be able to have conversations that sometimes become even volatile because of the language that we're using. But to understand where the root of all of that comes from is within a man's heart. And so sometimes we have to begin with how the heart needs to be healed so that we can move forward in a healthy way and be able to say, oh, where is that coming from? Is that coming from me? Oh my gosh. And do a lot of reflective inward examination of what's coming up for us when situations begin to occur. You know, if what's coming up in me is to be able to curse someone out or to put someone down or tear someone down or be able to, you know, call them other than who they are. I mean, I'm glad that we're having a conversation because this is a deep conversation that I think that when we're dealing with how we hurt others with our words or how hurtful situations begin to manifest itself, and to understand sometimes history plays a key role in what's coming up for us and how we might have been hurt, like you said, Miss Ann, and then how we retaliate and we perpetuate that hurt upon the others as well. So yeah, you know, and some of these things happen even in our childhood. And as we begin to understand, you know, how it hurt us in our childhood and then how we carry on and perpetuate that even into our adulthood is stuff we need to be talking about as well. So, you know, this is good that we've come here today to say, yeah, let's talk about it. Let's talk about, you know, some of these things that are coming up for us when it comes down to hurtful words.
I know when our queer elders group formed a couple years ago, there was a lot of debate about whether we were going to use that word queer, because for many of us, that word had been weaponized for decades, really. It's actually, Steve, do you want to talk about that a little bit? I know you have very strong views. Can you unmute?
Thank you. Yeah, as a young boy growing up in West Virginia, I was very special. I was very light in my loafers, as they used to say. That was a term that was not complimentary to me. I was a pansy. But the word queer, which was used a lot, I mean, it was all, you know, written on the walls. It was just and it was one of those words that was so hurtful that years ago, the gay community or the queer community, we took it back. We thought if we used it casually and more, and like the queer elders group, that people would be attracted to that and not look at it as a word of pain and suffering.
So kind of taking it back, I like that approach. It looks like, Bonnie, did you want to say something?
Yeah, this is very interesting to me. I really like terms and expressions and origins. And so this is a fascinating subject to me. I also don't like words used as slights or in a hateful, I'll say, way. But one part of using expressions that we've grown up with is that they get a meaning in certain areas, say, but they may not have that meaning elsewhere. And so you can use a word like queer to mean odd, and I really like it used that way. I really do not like the word queer used, referred to me or anybody else. I think to me, it's still offensive. So that's an interesting take that maybe all of us might have. I used to, when I was at the university, undergraduate, I was on a panel for gay, the term we used, gay college people. And so we had different classes in the sociology department, and we'd give these little presentations. And some people were so offended by some things. The word gay was very common then. And I do remember in particular this one woman who just could not stand the word gay, and just through the whole little meeting, she wanted to find a way, and she was not a gay person. But so it's, what I'm getting at is they can have a lot of meanings. And now I'm a lawyer, and the term grandfathered in is a legal term to me. And it means that something that existed before the law went into effect will continue to exist. And I do understand that in the United States, that has come often to refer to housing restrictions on people of color. I don't think of it that way. And I don't think I thought of it that way before I was a lawyer. I thought of it as a term you use for something that when the law changes, it just in a casual way, it continues to exist. And so I'm really torn on changing of use of some expressions or expressing use of some expressions. And I think what the former lady was saying, it's so much in how it's used and who's using it at whom. That's me. Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie. Yeah, I've been almost a little amused to see that real estate people have stopped referring to master bedrooms, because the master slave thing became it was all called out. So now they're all talking about primary bedroom or main bedroom. And in a way, I mean, it's kind of funny, but in another way, it's gracious. It's like saying, oh yeah, actually, I don't want my language to reflect that master slave.
Well, if I may respond, when you said master bedroom, I thought master of the house. And I thought the British use of master as the estate owner and family owner. So we do think of them in really different ways in different contexts.
Except, of course, though, too, sorry, that when you hear the master, I always hear male.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
And so it's just,
yeah,
but yeah, there's so many layers to unpack. But I don't know. I mean, language is, I remember, getting called a dyke, and that word still hurts me. But I actually had a roommate for a while in Somerville, and she just owned it. Her phone number was Mab Dyke, and I mean, and she loved it because she gave her phone number to somebody, they remembered it. but it was just but it was sort of a process for me to just sort of get over my own sort of hurt feelings when I heard that word. And I just really appreciated that my roommate, she just owned it. Anyway.
I think that's sort of part of what's behind the whole taking back the queer thing. Eve, do you want to step in?
Yes, I haven't. Now I have unmuted. Now I can lower my hand. I'm finding the word origin question to be really interesting. First off, I want to say that when we came to be queer elders, it was in response to all of Steve's work with out in front kind of organizations where they were chanting, "We're queer, we're here, get used to us," or "get used to it." And that, that was for me very intentionally honoring Steve and claiming history. And so to me, it's more than just saying, well, we're going to own this word. The word was owned before, and we needed to acknowledge that. And that I wasn't going to argue at all that, well, Steve, yeah, that was cool. That was in the 80s and 90s, and this is 2020. So I think that we have a root there that really needs to be honored. Also, younger people have already used queer to just define the whole community. and we were getting to the problem of, well, you older people just, aren't with it, which is A, true, and B, yeah, let's be relevant to some, let's see what's going on with language as it goes. The old okey doke was a term for scam, but the okey doke the word okey doke existed before the scam did. It was just a high sign for the scam. It was just a reference to the scam. So that all these words change all the time. And the resistance to words changes all the time. We have now in the trans community, all these people who are using they, and, some people won't do it. And people say how uncomfortable they are. And I've taken to reminding people, well, I'm old enough to remember when the word Ms. came in and how much resistance that fed, came up with. And now nobody thinks twice about it. So, we as that generation sort of led the way on that. These people on their generation will lead the way on this new changes. And at the same time, I'm really mindful that words can hurt and really surprise you, because I remember I was at my girlfriend's house, college girlfriend's house, after late college girlfriend's house up in Owen, Wisconsin, out east of Chippewa Falls and stuff. The first time I ever heard anybody use the word Jew as a verb. Oh, what? People really do that? And I wasn't particularly, I was completely surprised, completely shocked, and at the same time, neither shocked nor surprised. So it's what goes on with words is weird. People from Jewish people used to have fits with Scrabble for, having Jew as a word on the Scrabble board. It's a recognized word. I've heard serious Black Scrabble players saying, oh yeah, they'll use the N-word if that's what's going to be the best for their game. But only in those circumstances. And I'm be quiet now, Reed.
Well, I was just going to say something about the idea of the challenge of considering political correctness and whether it seems like, too much to be responsive to the idea of some of these words that we think of, like grandfathered in, being, or, your okey doke example, being like over hypersensitive. How do we navigate that? There are obviously words that are offensive to people, and we could argue with them about it, or we could try to be respectful about it. Is it worth winning that argument?
I'm just going to jump right back in because I got a classic example of what is correct. A number of us were at the city council to get their pride declaration this month. And I heard them, being very, very careful in their proclamation and always saying LGBTQIA+. And, if you hear that 8, 9 times in the middle of, as they read the proclamation, you realize, oh, this is not good. This is trouble. And I said, I have to tell you, I just say the queer and trans communities, because that covers sexuality and gender identity. And yesterday, I was driving over to a friend's house, and I was in the KUOW, and the ACLU is doing a pride support ad for yesterday, and they referred to us as the queer and trans community. So I think some things are changing, but right now there's a lot of people that I think we lose because they don't know all the numbers. They're afraid of not knowing all the letters.
I think you're right, Eve, because it's easy to, in fact, I heard some people from the city, drop a letter or two here and there because it is a mouthful, and it does start to seem kind of silly if it's included 5 times in 3 sentences. But I think, again, we go back to what Akuye said about the heart, that if somebody is really coming from the heart, they're not trying to be harmful or hurtful, and that gives it a real different flavor. Bonnie, I think you had something you wanted to add here, right?
Yes, we've been focusing for the last bit of the discussion on specific areas of terms that are used sometimes to offend people and sometimes not. But what about terms like grandfathered in, which, there are a lot of terms out there that, with a good heart, we don't mean anything by it, except to try to express something that other people will understand in a sentence. Now, you wouldn't necessarily want to call someone like a Native American. You wouldn't want to call a woman a squaw or a man a buck. And I say this because I'm from a Native American family, and I lived in that environment. And my mother and her family lived in that environment. So they know those terms, and they're not good terms. But there are so many terms that, that I can't even think of any now, but I bet if everybody here was asked to think of a term that may have some reference that is unsavory socially, what do we do with those? How do we identify? Because you do it by mistake sometimes. You just say something and then think, oh my gosh, what did I say? Or for example, oh my God, if somebody happens to be a certain kind of Christian or Muslim or something, that could be offensive.
Yeah, Reed is posting something here that he and I were looking at earlier, evolving from violent language. And Debbie Haase, I'm so glad you are here. You might want to talk a little bit about the language of peace.
I think I need a minute to think about that question. Thanks, Anne. The language.
Sure. You're just always someone I think about when I have to kind of figure out how to say something in a more gentle, generous way.
Well,
have been so
I
good
do
about
think
that.
about, this is where, like, for me, the intention and the impact comes in, is like, I may not be intending to hurt somebody by saying something, whether it's using the word, grandfathered in or whatever it might be, but my impact may be hurtful nonetheless. And so it's sort of like, and a lot of the times I'm just sort of ignorant. I can be ignorant about not knowing something, but still it can be harmful. So it's like just trying to keep learning and unlearning, and trying not to hurt, like everyone is speaking about. One of the terms that I've been reminded of many times in the is the word crazy, and how often that's used. And we've not talked about language that maybe escalates able-bodied people, but I hear that like probably almost every day. And that's really, I have been given feedback that that's hurtful.
Mhm.
And to try to think of, the more explicit word is hard, like, okay, it's surprising instead of, whatever that might be in the moment. And it's hard to think of those things really fast. So I find that it's helpful just to practice it sometimes when I'm by myself. What word could I use about that for instead of? But so I really appreciate your list, the instead of list, Reed. I really would love a copy of that.
Oh, we could put it in the chat. I think Akuye, you had something to say, and then after that, Laura.
Yeah, when we talk about these words, some of these terms, I looked at the terms that are linked to that harmful history. As we look at, how those terms were linked to a harmful history, you know, whether it's queer, whether it's nigger, whether it's, you know, these hateful slurs being called out of a hateful place. I look at that because they are the roots of how people really, how they receive them and then how they reject them, you know, and then, you know, when you've got turmoil coming up and you hear all of these language and all these words being lobbed at, you know, when, like, say, I'll give for examples, stuff that happened at the Capitol on the 6th and all those hateful, you know, words that was coming up, you know, they are linked to those events. So when we look at how these terms are coming up for us in harmful ways in our history, you know, whether it's past, present, or how we gonna move in the future, we have to understand, you know, the experience of how these words are showing up and being manifested in our daily lives, in our interactions with one another. You know, you know, it's just not the word, it is how they're evolving and the experience of how they're evolving that really, you know, we set it in a place where we can understand, you know, where all of this hateful language is evolving from, you know. And so, yeah, you know, this is good that we're talking about it, but when we put it into that context, you know, of how it is manifesting and how it's coming up, then we know if it's coming from a hateful place. We know that. We can discern that much.
I think too, yeah, it's not just the word, is it? It's the whole energy and it's the action and it's the intent. Again, like you said, is it coming from the heart or is it coming from this place of fear and anger and actually hatred sometimes? And I think that kind of pushes me to that bystander place where I think, what's my role as a bystander if something is being said around me, maybe not at me, but how can I stand up to that? Or, you know, it's different. Like if I say something, I have a clear path to an apology, which we can talk about. But if someone else says that, I think that is, for a lot of us, it's a little murky. Like, how do we stand? And yet I know for myself, I feel like so many years, decades, millennia, probably centuries, people of color have had to carry the burden of this. Well, maybe people of white privilege should stand up and start taking some of the burden too. But how to do it effectively is another thing, because meeting violence with violence does not work. Meeting violence with, you know, anger isn't really very effective either, as any teenager can tell, right? Going head to head just isn't effective. But I have to say, I have seen Akuye and I have seen Debbie Hazy, both of you, diffuse situations that I thought were really volatile. And I'm really in awe of that, of your technique. And both of you do it with a lot of love, which makes me think of, you know, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that he said, you know, love is the only way through this stuff. But to be loving in the moment when you're really hurt and offended and upset, that takes some real depth of character or practice too, which kind of goes back to what you were saying, Debbie, that, you know, you practice sometimes to see if you can pull it off in the moment, right?
Yeah. This is all good. You know, I had actually just been having a conversation with my sister this morning about the difference between intent and impact. And I think, you know, you need to sort of honor both of them. And I love that, Reed's list. And you know, if there are things where we can just say, it's like, okay, yep, here's this term that we've been using. Some people know what it means. Other people don't, but it's like the Maya Angelou thing, once you know better, do better. And so having that list of substitutes that you can turn to, I think is really helpful, and trying to sort of, if you can in the moment, if somebody uses a term has that loaded or hurtful history, if you can, in the course of the conversation, sort of replace that word with something else that, and try to just change the terms and change it and see if you can bring them along. I don't know if that's.
Yeah,
that's a way-
I feel like those parents and others who raised the suggestion of changing the name of Wilkes School were saying, well, I just became aware of this. Let's see if we can find another name. And we did. So pretty soon, Holly's in the shoot seat will be on the side of that building up on North Madison, and we'll all get used to it.
I liked the process of that too, that there were three, I think they had a meeting and voted on choosing some names, and one was like Morning Sunshine Place or something like that. And one was Halil's, which is the name of the greeting stone, the shoot seat greeting stone that's out, I mean, the petroglyph stone at the top of the island, which is a sacred place name, but also a welcoming. And I'm trying to remember what the third one was, and I can't now, but the vote was interesting, that people wanted to have a word, wanted to have some say in it, and they ended up choosing something that felt like was pretty respectful. And I thought, I bet that didn't happen when they named it Wilkes in the first place. I think a lot of the naming around here, the whole West is full of white male place names, because as our, conquering people came through, they just said, hey, that looks that looks like a nice mountain, I'll name it for my commander or my uncle or whatever it is, right? But not for the people and not for the place. So looking deeper and trying to be more aware. I'm thinking about the Audubon Society too, right? I've been touched.
I'll just before you go to that, I'll just say it's Akiosuimatsu Elementary.
Oh, that's what it was. Right. Thank you.
Now,
right. And then people were saying, well, there's already some things in place to commemorate Akio, and maybe this is something that we haven't. And there has not been much commemoration on the island for the first people here, and the Suquamish people in particular. So I thought that was kind of gracious. Thank you. I'd forgotten what that was. But yeah, I was thinking about the Audubon too, that there's this whole movement of, do we still want to name our loving of birds after someone who actually was owned slaves and was pretty racist? Eve, you want to jump in?
Oh, of course I want to jump in. Just because I have to say, yeah, Wilkes was, early explorer here. He's the one who named it Bainbridge off for, an admiral who never was here. And Hood, St. Helens, Rainier, Baker, those are all named for members of the British Royal Admiralty, who were also never in the Northwest. That was Vancouver's doing. He said, well, I'll name them for the, people who pay my money, pay my wages. I just had to throw that in there. I think that one thing I wanted to say was that, when you were talking, Anne, talking about how you take something, when you started talking about what happens when you're a bystander, the two things can get easy to conflate. That if you're a bystander, you don't have the same anger or whatever. You need to let the person who's being talked to first lead as to what they're doing and how they're taking this. If somebody got between me and Marcus when I give Marcus a hard time for misgendering me, or George at the Queer Elders, that's just all in fun, but the bystanders may say, oh, no, that was a serious thing. And I don't think you can get angry on behalf of someone else. You can be curious on the behalf of someone else and say, wait a second, that sounded, do you mean to say it that way? Something like that. And not get caught up in that word is not allowed. I think there's if you're a bystander, that your job if you see something that doesn't seem quite right, is to be curious about it, as opposed to being offended on behalf of someone.
Well, I'm going to say, I know Debbie Hazy, again, you have used that curiosity on more than one occasion with pretty good results, right?
Yeah. And like Akuya mentioned earlier too, is I think it's, and like when I hear you speak, Eve, even your tone is, you have this curiosity in bringing it up, and it's coming from the heart. And I think that sometimes the words don't always matter. How you know, when you just ask, like, what did you mean by that? You know, you can say, what did you mean by that? And be, really be aggressive about it. But that tone and where it's coming from, again, what I'm hearing you say, well, one thing I wonder about, Eve, is like, don't want to get into that rescuer mode and think that you're going to save somebody else. It's not that. It's, or like what I would call maybe the white savior for me. And I think that can be a tricky wicket to to navigate that and make sure that doesn't happen for myself.
I think you're right. Reed, you wanted to jump in.
Well, there are just a few words, the N word, some words that are used for Jews and others, words like that I think you can say that offends me when you use that
Mhm.
word. I think that there are other words that might be, like maybe queer now is one that would be sort of, if it's offensive to you, you might, or at least curious to you, you might ask, why are you using that? Well, because that's what my offspring told me was the right word to use. So I'm trying to come out with a good heart about this. And then you can kind of see that in some cases, but I think there are some words that are just offensive to me, not as a white savior, just as a person.
Mhm. And especially for me, it's like words that dehumanize, words that strip dignity from others. Those are really hard to hear. And I think that's fair to say, whoa, I really don't like hearing that kind of word. I wonder, what you're actually trying to say, or maybe I don't want to know what you're actually trying to say. So I might put it in a different way, right? But to really start a conversation instead of an argument requires that true curiosity. But the deflection, I just was remembering this story that Oprah Winfield tells sometimes about being at Maya Angelou's house and having somebody start to tell a racist joke or something, which, are you kidding? How stupid is that in that setting? And that Maya Angelou just said, not in my house, you don't. And just turned the person out of the house. And I was like, whoa. But, yeah, there's times when I think it is appropriate to really call it out. But again, if you're trying to be heard and not just be right, I think there's some wiggle room there. Eve, I see you nodding. You want to?
But it's very important. What Debbie said, what Akuya said, what you're saying is it's from the heart. And there's different circumstances, and people, if you're telling anti-white or anti-black racist joke in Maya Angelou's house, you don't belong there. That's just clear. And but you need to approach things with just your humanity and with some humility. At the Dispute Resolution Center, the rescuer, we put that in the drama triangle. Something we try to avoid is, you have the rescuer, the victim, and the perpetrator. And the rescuer comes in and, to make things between the victim and the perpetrator, just, fine. And we'll say something that will, they don't want him, her, let's just say him in there, and then also, why are you picking on me? Why are you picking on her? That's my mom. I'm not arguing with you. Don't pick on her. And all of a sudden, the rescuer is now a victim. The perpetrator is the previous victim, and now it just switches around. You switch around these roles all the time. And if you're aware that how you can do that, then you can have the curiosity to say, well, wait a second, there is another way of doing things here. There is other word choices. When you were talking about the word crazy before, my first thought was, Patsy Cline, I'm Crazy, one of the great songs of all time. I am not giving it up. And that's referring to not, because crazy means whatever you want it to mean. It can be all sorts. There's, I'm mad about you. Just I'm mad at you and I'm mad about you are two different things. But you have to live within the circumstances. You have to live within the tone. We are actually a very tonal people. We keep saying that, Chinese, that's a tonal language. Depends, but what they mean depends on, exactly the tone. And I want to say, oh yeah, or yeah, it's just, which means two opposite things. But that because we are actually tonal.
Well, that
And
was a very interesting point, Eve, and I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think you're right. Bonnie, you've got something.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I'm going to stand on another side of this for a moment. And the Audubon brought it to my mind because I like the Audubon Society. I think it's a fine name, and there's probably more than one person named Audubon. And I like a beautiful opera called Tristan and Isolde. And there are some other things that I really like, and I've been cautioned about my likes because, well, Wagner wrote opera, and he happened to agree with the Nazi mentality. Wrote the operas, some of them that I like, and Audubon was, he established the watching of the American or the North American birds, and I appreciate that very much. And because they at their time had a lifestyle that we don't understand and don't approve of, and it wasn't approved of by a lot of people at that time. I just don't think that I should be questioned. Whether I should or not, I don't know. But I don't like it when I mention an opera and somebody says, well, Wagner wrote that. How can you like that? Or when I want to eat a steak and somebody says, that's an animal. There are cautionings, and there are that I would like to hear. If I said, for instance, crazy, if I said, oh, you're acting crazy, and somebody said, I'm offended by your use of that, I wouldn't do it again. And I would be more cautious. But I don't think we can put our values today on everybody in the past. And I don't think we can put them on some people today. Something that interests me, that intrigues me, I've been involved throughout, a lot of my life with community councils. And community councils go before different commissions and boards and ask for things or don't want things. And what has become, what is that word I'm looking for? Yeah, the term NIMBY, which means not in my backyard. And it has become so offensive, and I'm even offended when I say it, because it insults anybody who has a close interest in a project, a close interest by living near it. And that's a kind of, I know it's prejudice in a different way. It's using terms that could mean something in a different way, but I feel over-censored sometimes by an individual's understanding of another time or another word. And that bothers me. And I probably do it to other people sometimes too. So I guess what I'm saying here is, how do we approach it? If it's offensive enough, I will ask somebody not to do it. Or if it's purposely offensive, or if it's what I deem sexist, if I'm called young lady, I'm a little offended by that but at the same time, I understand, depending on who's saying it to me, if he's 93 years old, he might not know what else to say. If he's 33, he might be ignorant. I don't know. It's a hard thing, but I don't think that our values belong on all situations. I think that's something to look at.
I think you're right. And, it makes me think about like when I was trying to read children's books to my grandkids and the books that I loved reading to my kids, and I'm horrified now. My daughter-in-law resolved some of that by making new dialogue and pasting it over the old dialogue in the books because she liked the drawings. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, embedded history of use of a lot of terms that today are really unacceptable in a lot of ways. Akuye, I wonder if you would be willing to talk a little about like, how do we hear some of this stuff, and what is a good way to diffuse unacceptable language and unacceptable, what would you say, behavior, attitude?
Well, a lot of what we're talking about today is coming from a place of prejudice and judgment and bullying and criticizing and fault finding and being very abusive in the way that we communicate with others. And so, when we talk about, how these things come up in our what I say, how we engage with one another as human beings. You're talking about communication engagement. That's what we're talking about when you talk about words that hurt or words that offend or words that, bring, all kinds of what I call it really evokes anger, bitterness, hatred, all of these things. Look at the words that evoke this type, because when you say a thing, I expect if I called you something, then what I'm doing is evoking or trying to evoke something out of you, as well as spread something throughout others. And so I look at that, I kind of just sit back. I said, okay, when I'm here and I'm calling, I'm offending you by whether it's your race or your way of being or walking through this. And what am I actually doing? This is like a verbal bully. Mm-hmm. Verbal bullying. When you're talking about hurtful words and offensive words, what is it? It comes from a place of hate and criticism and all of, you got to understand where these words are originating from. They're originating from emotions and different things that are within us. Just being, that, when you talk about, being hateful or nitpicking or, that comes with a spirit. No one wants to talk about what type of spirit is manifesting in us. It has a spiritual tone that is being brought up. And so, yes, it manifests itself in the natural and emotional realm, and you're talking about these things, but when we see these things coming up, we need to know what really is going on, as these words, because these words have power. Words have power. We know words have power. For us to sit up here and say that words don't have power, they do. We can speak kind words. What does kind words do for us? We can speak caring and loving words. They evoke stuff, and hateful words do the same thing. And so as we begin to talk about, these words that hurt and they're harmful and this, understand what's happening in the spiritual and the natural realm of why these words and what these words are perpetuated. We have to have a clear understanding of that. And so when they come up, we can understand, oh, no, we don't want to get caught up in that. How do we diffuse that?
Exactly. And that's something I would say too, like, how do we heal? We're going to flip it around. And as you say, words have power. So what are some of the healing ways that we can counter? Sometimes, like I was saying earlier, it requires a real apology,
Yes.
which God knows I've had to do any number of times. And, to me, the apology also has to be from the spirit and from the
Yes.
heart.
Yeah.
It's not just like, sorry.
Well,
That's
I
really
can,
hard.
you know what, we go back to kindergarten here. When two kids or they get into a conflict and everything, and then the teacher says, well, now tell each other that you're sorry. And then you got one that's very remorseful, very repentant, very humble and say, oh, I'm sorry, please forgive me. And then you have the other one that say, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm like, oh, it's coming from a different place. And so we can discern who is very remorseful and very sorrowful than the one that just like, yeah, you made me say I'm sorry, but I'm not really sorry. There's nothing changed within that heart that would transform, how they would come back as friends or how they would react with or interact with one another, because we can discern, even the child can discern who's genuine, who's fair, who's unfair, who's loving, who's kind, who's not. These are innate things within our human being human that we can really discern. Even a child can discern who's being kind to them.
For sure. And we know perfectly well when somebody is not sincere too. Steve, it
right.
looked like you had something you wanted to say, and Rita also.
That's correct.
Steve, you're muted.
I was just thinking about the origin of all this hate and all this judgment. Where does that come from? And that perpetuates these words of hate and judgment and putting people in a place that's lower than where they are so they can feel better about themselves. I know I go ranting on and on about how much the church has created a lot of pain for women, queers, or the queer community. And it's like, how do you stop that movement of the church and the judgment? It's been going on for millennium, as we know. And women have been put in their place because you have not been elevated to a place of being a priest or whatever. Things are changing, I know, but I guess that's all I needed to say.
Thank you, Steve. Rita.
Well, I was thinking, when you said about kids, when I was young, very young, I was probably about 6. And there was a neighbor boy who was mean to my sister. And I, of course, went over and made sure that he knew that he wasn't to talk to her or hit her again. And my mom said, you can't do that. And you have to go apologize, tell him you're sorry. And I, at 6, I looked her in the eye and I said, I'm not going to. I said, because I'm not sorry that I did it. Now, I eventually got that worked out. But, that's just, I think sometimes we have to think about that for a while. And you see that in kids. And so you're hoping that there's adults around who can help children navigate so that it doesn't come to hitting, obviously. But, it was a different time, believe me. And I don't do that anymore, even when somebody is mean to my sister. But and then the other thing my mom always said is, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything. And I think even as we think about that, and somebody's saying something, and your immediate reaction might be something to say, I always go, okay. Now I do. When I was 20, I probably didn't, but I say, I don't even have to respond. And I can think about what I want to. So I carry a roll of, duct tape in my little pocket here, in my fake pocket, and I pull it out and I put it over my mouth so that I can think about what it is that I might want to say. And then I can say, well, why was I going to say why was I so quick to respond? What was it that it really hit? And so then I can think about how I'm feeling. And then I can think about, I'm happy that I didn't respond in a negative way or a mean way. And that I can go back and I can, have a different kind of conversation with that person. And in my head, I can run over, 2 or 3 or 15 things that I would say differently. And will probably next time the person does it. But it takes, it takes a lot of practice. It does for me. I'll speak for myself. It takes a lot of practice. And as I've gotten older, thank heavens, earned more grace and more patience and stuff like that. So that's all I had to say.
Those are good things to say. You made me think about, when I used to travel around the country trying to talk to people about sustainable gardening and stuff like that, and I'd run into these pockets of deep resistance from people who really like to use pesticides or whatever it was. And I realized if you want to be heard, it's much better to be interested and curious than to be angry. Because for one thing I learned early is nobody wants to hear an angry woman at all. But to meet people with your humanity and in that humble spirit, Debbie, I bet you have something to say about that.
Well, I just have a question that I'm leaving with that I wanted to express, and that this is really brought up for me, is going beyond what is not hurtful language, but part of what you're talking about is healing. So I'm going to sit with, how do I go beyond what's not hurtful, what's neutral? What is, how can I speak and act in that healing way? What does that actually look like and feel like? And yeah, so anyhow, that's what I'm leaving with.
I am so appreciative. And all of you, thank you so much for showing up and for bringing your concerns and your thoughts and your ideas. We have so much to learn from each other. And what a rich, look at this. This is such a treasure trove of wonderful people with great experience and depth and heart. I love that. And thank you so much.